One or two of you may remember I did a exhortation on Habakkuk last year. It was just a particular verse that jumped out at me and I was interested in it. If you don't remember it, you'd be the same as me. I couldn't remember what I said, but it was a catalyst to do a couple of classes. A couple of people said, is this part of a study? And the answer was no, but maybe it should be. So I asked for 2 classes, but it's turned out I needed 3. So we're going to do a night on each of the 3 chapters. It's only a small book. One thing I've learned is how to spell Habakkuk. So that's a good start. I kept putting the K in the wrong spot and a double B's, but so we got that. So that's all good. I've called it Asking the Difficult Questions of Life. It's actually a really interesting book. I've really enjoyed the study, and one thing I think that's really highlighted to me is how Scripture is all fitted together. You know, it's just in 3 chapters, what Habakkuk describes and the references he uses is just quite amazing. It's quite staggering, really, and really encouraging. You know, that God is in control, and you know, even back at the time of Habakkuk, you know, God is leading his people. So I've called it Asking the Difficult Questions of Life. How long? How long will I cry and you're not here? Habakkuk poses some questions. Why does evil triumph? And in particular, in his case, in Judah. Why will God punish Judah by means of a nation more evil still? Why does God allow another oppressor to rise up when the Assyrians have been overthrown? Why does he allow another oppressor to rise up? How can a righteous God act in this way? You know, they're very challenging questions, aren't they? And he poses the question, what have you got to say about this God? What's your answer to these questions? We find that the answer is that, well, all evil will perish in their turns. God will come, you will act for the salvation of his people as he has in the past. There is an appointed time. So I can see Habakkuk's situation. He's seeing this turmoil and he can't quite understand how God's working. What have you got planned, God? What's the future? But in the meantime, the just must live in faith. Now that's the key verse in Habakkuk 2. Right. I don't know why it's not working, but oh, here we are. Always like when I look at a subject. Yes, that's right, exactly right. Wait for it. Yeah, well, I've been waiting a while. I like to do the who, where, why, what, when before I start something, because it helps you get a feeling for where we're at with it. So, you know, background for something, we look at a book like Habakkuk, only 3 chapters, and it's hard to get into it. You know, why is he writing it? What's going on in his life and in the life of the nation for what he's written there? So who's Habakkuk? Well, if you've got your Bibles there, if you can open up book of Habakkuk, it's after Nahum, it's right towards the end of the Old Testament. Habakkuk, verse 1 says that he's the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. So we're told that he's a prophet. And chapter 3, verse 1, again, it says the prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet. So we know he's a prophet. He's possibly a Levite, because at the very end, the last verse in Habakkuk, it says to the chief singer and director of music. So most likely he's a Levite. It says, on my stringed instruments. And we know from 2 Chronicles with David and the captain of the army separated to the service the sons of Asaph and of Heman, of Jeduthun, who would prophesy with harps, with psalteries, and with cymbals. So there's those that played on stringed instruments. That's all we really know about Habakkuk. Where is he writing? Well, if you look at verse 4 of chapter 1, it says, therefore the law is slack. So he talks about the law. So that sort of narrows down a little bit. We're talking about God's people, Israel, Judah. It talks in verse 1 of chapter 2 about standing upon my watch, sitting upon the tower. So when we combine that with the priestly service that we saw in chapter 3, we can say most likely he's writing from Jerusalem. But it's interesting, isn't it, that not a lot of details given about him or where he actually is. That's really appropriate, isn't it? There's no exact location or people that are mentioned, even though, you know, we can see by the fact he's talking about the law, about the priestly service, about praying to God. We can assume it's Jerusalem. We're talking of Judah. But by lacking those specific things, it makes it very, very relevant to the faithful of all ages. And we'll see that as we go through. So when was it? When was it that he was writing? Well, there's Habakkuk just there. I believe it's, as we'll see, just between the Assyrian and Babylonian periods. So Jeremiah, we'll see, Jeremiah was around at the same time. Possibly Nahum and Obadiah. The question is, what kings were around at that time? Just the changeover, really, between the Assyrians and the Babylonians. There's another one's probably easier to see. There's Habakkuk there again. So we can see that it falls just around 650, between 600 and 650 BC. What was going on then? Well, 612 BC, the Assyrian capital was overrun by the Babylonians. So Nineveh was overrun by the Babylonians. They moved the capital to Carchemish. Pharaoh Necho, the Egyptian, who was allied with the Assyrians, he marches up against the Babylonians. So the Babylonians were just starting to come into power there. The Assyrians were around. They were the ruling power of the area. And then Babylon is raising their head. As we said, they've taken Nineveh, and the Assyrians moved to Carchemish. Now, Pharaoh Necho, coming up from the Babylonians, King Josiah decides to go out to fight against him, if you remember, in 2 Chronicles 35. We're not told why he does that. Maybe he didn't want the Egyptians crossing in through their land. We don't know, but we do know that Josiah is killed going out to fight against Pharaoh Necho. That's the Battle of Megiddo. So here's a little bit of a picture there. Pharaoh comes up from Egypt. He's heading up where the word Assyria is there. That's about where Nineveh was. Babylon comes up and conquers that. The Assyrians move their capital to Carchemish, and the Egyptians go up to help them. They get waylaid a little bit to fighting Josiah. Josiah gets killed, and Pharaoh Necho continues up to fight with Assyria against the Babylonians. So he's killed, Josiah's killed. We've got Jehoahaz, his 23-year-old son, and he reigns for 3 months. He gets taken down to Egypt. And he's replaced by Jehoiakim, also called Eliakim, his 25-year-old brother. Jehoiakim reigns for 11 years. Now, interesting, isn't it? The younger son was the one that they chose to be king. Jehoahaz was 23. Jehoiakim was 25. He should have really been appointed king, but they appointed Jehoahaz. So that tells you something about Jehoiakim, doesn't it? Straight away, that he was second choice. And when you read the record, as we know, he was an evil king. He had 11 evil years of reign. So the Battle of Carchemish, we're told in Jeremiah 46, was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Now, I'm going into a bit of detail here because it's really important, I believe, to get a context of what's going on, why Habakkuk is writing what he is, why he's writing the way he is, what's he experiencing at that time. So we can understand the ins and outs of the powers that were interacting with Judah. So the Egyptians and the Assyrians, they're defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in Jeremiah 46. So, as we said, the younger son, who was made king, reigned for 3 months. Oh, sorry, we missed a bit there. After the Battle of Carchemish, Jehoiachin, which is Jehoiakim's son, he only reigned for 3 months. He was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. So he's the 3 months, and then Zedekiah, who reigned 11 years. And as we know, that's the last king to sit on the throne. So that's where we are, right towards the end of the time of Judah, really. But Babylon hadn't really risen to power at that time. Got the final revolt. Babylon destroys Jerusalem, and the king and the people taken into captivity. All right. So when we look at that, the record tells us the Chaldeans were now in power, but they hadn't invaded. Because if we have a look at we turn up Habakkuk 1, verse 6, we're told, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. So we find when Habakkuk is writing, the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, hadn't entered the land at that stage. So we're talking right around the time after the Battle of Carchemish, when Babylon is starting to conquer or finishing conquering Assyria. This is the time that he's writing. So we're looking somewhere in that period between the Battle of Carchemish and the time when Jehoiakim's son took over, because Nebuchadnezzar already takes Jehoiachin. So there's that period there. Somewhere in that time, is when he's writing. Let's turn up 2 Chronicles. You're going to come back to Habakkuk, so keep your finger there or your electronic. Keep your finger there, I guess. Let's turn up 2 Chronicles 35. Because again, it gives us a little more detail. Can anyone read that for us, please? 2 Chronicles 36, from verse 5 to verse 17. Any volunteers, please? Yes, please, mate, if you would. Thanks, Joseph.
He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Against Babylon, bound him in chains. Nebuchadnezzar also carried out part of the vessels of the house of the Lord and put them in his palace in Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, the abominations that he did, and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Jehoiachin, his son, place. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of them. And so the year, in the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar precious vessels of the house of the Lord, made his brothers by a king over Judah and Jerusalem. 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil by the Lord his God. He did not humble before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord and the God of Israel.
We might just stop there, I think, Joseph. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So this is exactly the time that we're talking about. We see there in verse 5, Jehoiakim was 25. He reigned 11 years. And his reign was evil, 11 evil years. We see that he's taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. We saw, did you misread, or did your version say he was 18? Jehoiachin. Verse 9. 18, okay, right. The King James says he was 8 when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months and 10 days. Is it? That's interesting. At the driving age is not 18. All right, he's taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. His brother Zedekiah reigns 11 evil years as well. All right. Now, verse 14 is where we stopped. You can see how the kings were evil, and the people were. It says all that as a result. Moreover, all the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the nations, and polluted the house of Yahweh, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. So all the chief of the priests, it makes a point of saying all of them, and the people transgressed very much. So it really gives us an idea not only of the powers that were around at the time, but what was actually going on in Jerusalem. Absolutely. Absolutely. And look what he says, verse 15. Yahweh, God of their fathers, sent to them by their messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. So he raised up messengers, one of which was Habakkuk. They mocked the messengers of God. So there's Habakkuk writing this message, and the people are, all the priests, all the people, all the kings are just evil. They mocked the message that was being sent by God, and they despised his words, it says, verse 16, misused his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh arose against his people, till there was no remedy. So you can see how things went worse and worse. And they kept doing it until God acted, until Yahweh arose against his people. Therefore, as a result of that, he brought upon them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maid, old man, or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. You can see he gave them into the hands of the kings of the Chaldeans. And that brings us exactly back now to Habakkuk, verse 6, where God says, I'll raise up the Chaldeans. So you can see how what we saw there in Chronicles is exactly what the prophet Habakkuk is describing. Why was he writing? Well, we saw evil is just all around us. The wicked seem to prosper. How do we cope with that? Habakkuk asks, God doesn't seem to act. How should we respond? These are the type of questions that Habakkuk poses for us. This is not just a series of warnings for Judah. What Habakkuk's doing is reflecting on God's principles of how he deals with both the wicked of his own people and the Gentiles. What is God going to do? And he concludes with the attitude the faithful need to have in time of trouble. You can see why it's so relevant for us today. When evil's all around, God doesn't seem to have acted as yet. How do we deal with that? What's our attitude? All right, well, quickly going through Habakkuk chapter 1. Why do you show me iniquity? Verse 2 says, how long? How long will I cry and you will not hear? Even cry unto you of violence and you will not save. There's nothing happening. I'm crying out to you for what's going on in this city. Nothing changes. You don't seem to hear. You don't seem to act. He says, verse 3, why do you show me iniquity and cause me to behold grievance? What I'm seeing all around me, why are you allowing it to take place? Why are you making me see all this trouble? Or in verse 3, or because it's one of those little key words. Because spoiling and violence are before me. New King James says plundering. You can see the attitude that's there. And violence are before me. There are that raise up strife and contention. You can feel what Habakkuk's going through in Jerusalem. The violence, the strife, it's plundering. People don't care about anyone else. And I'm surrounded by the wicked. The law is slacked. Judgment does never go forth. The wicked just compass around the righteous. Therefore, wrong judgment proceeds. We're surrounded by wicked people, by wicked actions. Why haven't you acted, God? Surely you see what's going on. Question is, do we ever feel like that ourselves? When we look at the world around us, society, the evil seems to prosper. Sometimes we can throw our hands up in despair, can't we, of what goes on? You know, as a grandparent, you worry about First off, you as a father or a parent, you worry about your children, and as your children become adults and parents, you worry about your grandchildren. As the world gets worse and worse, you wonder the impact that society is going to have on your grandchildren. When will you act, God? When will you resolve these issues? Well, God hears and God responds to all these questions that Habakkuk is posing. God hears, he responds. He says, behold ye among the nations and regard and wonder marvelously. For I will work a work in your days which you will not believe. So we told you. God responds to Habakkuk and says, I'm actually going to respond in your days. Back in Isaiah, if you just come back there, please. Judah was already warned by the prophet Isaiah, who was before Habakkuk, of what was going to take place. Quite interesting. Woe to Ariel, and we know Ariel is Jerusalem, the city where David dwelt, so there's an explanation. Let's jump to verse 3. I will camp against thee round about, and will lay siege against thee with a mount, and I will raise forts against thee. And thou shalt be brought down, and shalt speak out of the ground. Thy speech shall be low out of the dust. Thy voice shall be as of one that has a familiar spirit out of the ground. So God says, I'm actually going to lay siege. I'm going to bring someone that's going to lay siege against you with mounds, and I'll raise forts against you. What was the reason? Well, in the same chapter of Isaiah, chapter 29, look at verse 9. Stay yourselves and wonder, cry out and cry. They are drunken, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. This is the very people in Jerusalem. For Yahweh hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes. The prophets and your rulers, the seers has he covered. The vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he says, I cannot, for it is sealed. Let's jump to verse 15. Woe to them that seek deep to hide their counsel from Yahweh, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who sees us? Who knows us? So there's the description of what was taking place in Jerusalem. And God says, I'm going to lay a siege to you. I'm going to build up mounds against you. Therefore, verse 14, behold, I proceed to do a marvellous work among this people, even a marvellous work and a wonder. That's exactly what God is saying in Habakkuk. A marvellous, I'll do a work, a wonder marvellously. I'll do a work in your days which you will not believe. It's going to be in your days. Well, that quote is quoted by Paul in Acts 13. Turn there if you would. I'll pose the question, why does Paul quote Habakkuk in Acts 13? Acts 13 verse 41. Behold, ye despisers, and wonder and perish, for I work a work in your days, a work which ye shall in no wise believe, though a man declare it unto you. Why do you reckon Paul would be quoting from Isaiah and Habakkuk? Exactly this, yeah, well, exactly the same problem. Same problem with the priests, same problem with the powers that be. 100%, that's exactly right. And that's 100% the answer. It's so relevant because we read in Isaiah 29, the vision of all this has become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that has learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. He says, I cannot, for he is sealed. That's exactly the situation that was in Jerusalem. The priests there didn't understand God's word. Acts 13, just a few verses before that quote, Paul says, for they that dwell at Jerusalem and their rulers, because they knew him not, nor yet the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath day, they have fulfilled them in condemning him. So, as Fran said, God sent one, and they didn't believe. It was the word made flesh, and they didn't believe. I will work in your days, yet you won't believe. We saw back there, Acts 13, he says, which are read every Sabbath day. And then we go to the record in Luke, talks about Jesus. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, stood up to read. So even though the word made flesh was there reading God's word, they didn't understand. Interesting, he delivered the book of the prophet Isaiah. He tells them what he was all about. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. That was his role. Yet they didn't understand. That's right. He closed the book, he gave it to the minister, he sat down. This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. So we're saying that God has acted in the past, and he will do so again. He says, verse 6, I raise up the Chaldeans. This is God's word. I raise up the Chaldeans. Who were they? Well, we know Chaldeans were used interchangeably, really, for Babylon, for Babylonians. The land of the Chaldeans, so the southern part of Babylon, or Iraq today. Number of kings were all Babylonian. Kings were actually all Chaldean kings. The two cultures seem to have been used interchangeably in Isaiah. Belshazzar was called king of the Chaldeans. So they were originally, I think, a social class they were, but they became, they originally came from southern Babylon, but they became identified as a social class. That's right. That's right. But then we find that they're just described as interchangeably as Babylonians. The King Nebuchadnezzar's advisors were called Chaldeans. They're highly educated in astronomy and astrology. It's been suggested perhaps they where the wise men came from. So 6, 7, 8 describes this terrible nation of the Chaldeans. Remember, the Assyrians are just on their deathbed. The Babylonians were taking them, or the Chaldeans were just taken them over. This is the description of it. A bitter and a hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They're terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed for themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards, more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead, their cavalry comes from afar, they fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. That really gives us a description of what these people were like. They were fearsome. And they were the epitome of pride. When we look at Babylonians, they really stand out as being pride. They're called bitter and hasty. That says ruthless and greedy, or fierce and impetuous. Terrible and dreadful were described as. That says frightening and terrifying. There in verse 7, it's a funny expression in the King James, their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. It's a really odd expression. You think, what's that all talking about? Amplified says their justice and authority originates with themselves and are defined only by their decree. So you can see it's all about them. They're in control. They will set the perimeters. They decide for themselves what is right. So you can see why I say they're the epitome of pride. This, verse 9, they all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold. They heap up earthen vessels and seize it. Look at, you can't help see the focus. It's all about them. Their judgment, their dignity, their charges, their cavalry. And it's interesting, remember that we saw in Isaiah, woe to Ariel. God said, I'll heap up earthen mounds. The Assyrians never did that. He's saying the Babylonians are going to do it. At the end of verse 10, they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. So we're being told right back in Isaiah that was going to be the Babylonians that were going to conquer Jerusalem. Epitome of pride. We'll look more of that next class, chapter 2. I think it's quite amazing that they chose the word pride to describe their movement. Well, heap dust and take it. Second King says against the Assyrians, we know it was going to be the Assyrians that were going to cast the mounds up against Jerusalem. Therefore, thus saith Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. So it wasn't going to be the Assyrians that were going to take Jerusalem. But Jeremiah 6 says, thus said Yahweh of armies said, hew ye down trees and cast them out against Jerusalem. So we're obviously talking different time, different people. This is the city to be visited. She is wholly oppressed in the midst of her. Behold, a people cometh from the north country. A great nation shall be raised from the sides of the earth. They lay hold on bow and spear. They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roars like the sea. They ride upon horses, set in array as men for war against the daughter of Zion. Remember, we started looking at the background of who was around, and we saw Jeremiah was writing at the same time as Habakkuk. And here he is describing the Babylonians, just as Habakkuk does in verse 6 to 10. They were a cruel and fierce people. Verse 11, though, very interesting, says, then he changes his mind. His mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offence, ascribing this power to his God. We actually find that the Babylonians coming down was a forerunner for Gog, the true king of the north. So what's being played out here in Habakkuk's days is the same. It's what's going to take place in the latter days. We'll look more of that in class 3. Really interesting. When you see how it all fits together, it's just fascinating. So God's response, that creates a problem for Habakkuk. Imagine if you're saying, you know, this city is filled with violence. Aren't you going to do something? God says, I'm going to bring the Chaldeans, a fierce people, against them. It's going to pretty much wipe out Jerusalem. That would be a problem, wouldn't it? It's not what Habakkuk was hoping for, I'm sure. In verse 12, Habakkuk says to God, so from verse 1 to verse 4 is Habakkuk talking, and then verse 5 to verse 11 is God telling what he's going to do, how he's going to bring the Chaldeans, and describes what they're going to do. Then Habakkuk responds in verse 12, aren't you from everlasting, God? Aren't you in control? He says in verse 13, you're of pure eyes and behold evil, canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked devours the man that is more righteous than he? So, how are you letting this happen? How can you even look on this evil? The King James, part of the way through, it says, wherefore lookest thou upon them? That's the same word as in verse 3. Why? Why are you looking upon these evil people? Why are you allowing this to happen? You can see Habakkuk poses challenging questions, doesn't he? How is this being allowed to happen? Well, Habakkuk says in verse 14, you make men as the fish of the sea, as the creeping things that have no ruler over them. They take them, all of them, with the angle, they catch them in their net and gather them in their drag. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice under their net, they burn incense under their drag, because by them their portion is fat and their meat plenteous. And I'm reading that and I'm saying, I don't quite get all that. I get some of it, but it's a little bit confusing. I don't normally quote the Message Bible, but I have this time. Yeah, because it actually just, yeah, that's right. I wouldn't do a Bible study with that, but I think it really gives you a bit of an idea, the sense, anyway, of what Habakkuk is trying to say. You're treating men and women as so many fish in the ocean, swimming without direction, swimming but not getting anywhere. Then this evil Babylonian arrives and goes fishing. He pulls in a good catch. He catches his limit and fills his bucket. A good day of fishing. He's happy. He praises his rod and reel. He piles his fishing gear on an altar and worships it. It makes his day, and he's going to eat well tonight. So I think that really gives the sense of what Habakkuk's saying here. That men are just like fish in a net, being caught. Is that the future? Is that what we've got to look forward to? The Babylonians worship their own strength. They've gone fishing, they've used the net, and they've caught people. So they worship the means that they've caught those people. chapter 1 finishes with, shall they therefore empty their net and not spare continually to slay the nations? ESV says, is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? What's the future, God? Is that what he's got in plan? Is that what you've got? This is just going to be an endless cycle of nations arising, one nation conquering another, Jerusalem being taken captive, the wicked prospering. Is that the future? Well, let's see what he says, how God responds in chapter 2, next class.